Hello YouTube, this is Morgan Airspeed Prime here with my next Avatar video. In this one I want to cover the relatively big news that is the reveal of Princess Zeisan's design in official art for the first time, but also to address the sort of issue of like, wait, a lot of people, a lot of fans don't actually know who Princess Zeisan is. They see other fans being like, oh my god, this is so cool, we finally have official art for this character, but they're like, who? And obviously the problem that comes up is that this is a character who we only know about because she's been covered in the Avatar Legends role-playing game book, which is not necessarily story content as such, it's more straight like lore setting information. So we know stuff about her, but we don't really know the full story. So the first part of this video, just the first couple of minutes, will be just covering the image, where it came from, what's going on with it, and then I'll get into a sort of recap covering all the information we know about Princess Zeisan, so you can either refresh yourself on her if you're somewhat familiar with the character, or just learn about her for the first time. So let's get into the image. Here it is on screen here. As you can see, her design, very, very cool. She is of course, princess of the Fire Nation. She is Fire Lord Sozan's sister. So you can see here a lot of the kind of artifacts that you would expect with that kind of hairpiece, the red clothing, the kind of spikes from this kind of era of the Fire Nation as well. It's kind of interesting. But the big thing that a lot of people will note, she's wearing an Air Nomad necklace. What's going on there? In combination with the fact that she's doing like an open hand kind of martial art form. If she's Fire Nation, would she not be doing fists? Because firebending for the most part is more of a closed fist style form. What's going on here? Who is this character? And we will get to that. But just to cover where the image actually came from, because I did see a lot of people posting it around being like, oh cool, art for Zeisan, without actually mentioning ever where they got the image from. So as you can see from the video title there, this comes from the Magpie Games video, Avatar Legends role-playing game All-Star Actual Play Session 0. It's also part of the Session 1 video. It's part of their kind of 30-second intro, covering the intro to the story that they're doing. Now, these two videos are only available to Kickstarter backers for Avatar Legends at the moment, which is why the video is listed as being unlisted. So I won't be linking this video. They say that it will be available publicly at a later point, so just be aware of that. So I'm only going to be playing a couple of seconds of this video just so you have the context for where this image actually came from. Now, what the videos are is some of the voice actors from Avatar, along with more kind of notable RPG related people. It's them playing a game that they can use to kind of promote how the game is played and have a very kind of produced kind of session of the game. Now, they told us months ago the details of what this story is. It's going to be a Roku era story. The adventure they're doing is called An Urgent Request, and the basic description of it is this. The renowned air nomad Ryo has uncovered a plot to discredit Princess Zeisan and her air nomad teachings. However, the nun and the princess have a past, and Ryo can't just go to Zeisan and tell her about the plot. Instead, she enlists the help of the heroes to warn the princess and foil whatever nefarious plot their enemies have planned. So the idea with An Urgent Request is that according to their most recent update, we are more than likely going to get this adventure as a PDF within the next month or so. So we have a better context for what the story that they're actually, the framework of story that they're doing in the All-Star Play actually is. So there will be little bits and pieces of canon information when we get that PDF. And I'm wondering, is that where this image actually comes from? When we get that PDF, will it have this image of Ryo there? Otherwise, where's this image? Where does it come from? Is this just Avatar Studios kind of part of their content library that they have images for these characters? It'll be interesting to see, because there's usually some imagery in the adventure booklets, because there's going to have to be an urgent request image on the front and so on. And I'm assuming because Ryo and Zeisan are the main characters, that the likelihood is that this image is there and maybe we get an official canon design for Ryo as well. Because otherwise, like, Roku doesn't particularly seem to be involved in this story, even though it's his era. and they're the kind of main characters. Maybe Chondro as well. Maybe we'll get Chondro, but I'll cover the details on who those characters are shortly. So let's actually just watch the first 30 or so seconds of this video so you have the context for what's going on here.
Air, water, earth, fire. The world is currently in an unprecedented time of peace. Avatar Roku, with the help of the air nomads, worked tirelessly to ensure balance is maintained between the four nations, but not even the Avatar can be everywhere at once. In the heart of the Fire Nation, a heated storm is brewing. Fire Lord Zeisan and his sister Princess Zeisan vie for political dominance, and with the arrival of Ernan Raishan, tensions are at an all-time high. With the Avatar away, new heroes must rise, or this Cold War could soon turn very hot.
Okay, so keep in mind, these are the characters that the players, as part of this all-star play, make. These are not canon characters. They are, in the context of what happens in this story, and if you're meant to view this story as being canon, the idea is meant to be that a group of heroes assists the canonical characters with their issue. Not that these individual characters are meant to be canon as such, as far as I'm aware. So do keep that in mind. But yeah, Princess Zeisan, or Zeisan as they pronounce it there in the intro, is a little bit weird because, again, keep in mind that the way it's spelled is Zeisan, but they pronounce it as if it's the S and the Z are like reversed. It's like Zeisan rather than Zeisan. Now, I don't know, maybe that's region accurate pronunciation, perhaps, but I don't really know. Are we meant to view that as being the correct pronunciation, or was that just that person's best attempt at saying it? I don't really know. The same with however they pronounced Rishan. What way did they specifically say it, actually?
With the arrival of Ernan Raishan, tension...
Raishan. So that's interesting. Like, the O isn't really like a focus in this. That's an interesting one. So excuse me if I'm pronouncing them differently as we go through this, because I don't think we have a super accurate pronunciation of what's going on with these characters. But that is just to cover where the image of the character kind of comes from, just for anyone aware. So we hopefully, with an urgent request, should have maybe a better sense for the image and the character in the coming month. But for now, I'll switch over and we'll go through everything we know about the character. Okay, so what I have up here on screen is the Avatar Legends role-playing game core book. We are in the Roku section in terms of the information on the various eras, and of course I was just down there at the Zeisan section, but we'll go up to the start just so we have a little bit more context. So the Roku era. Now, interestingly, the Roku era specifically details the time between Zeisan's coronation and Avatar Roku's wedding. So that's an important thing. We are set before Avatar Roku's wedding. The key thing to remember with the wedding is that that is the first time that Roku sees in Zeisan any sense that he might be a problem. Now, he lets that one go for the most part, and then later discovers that Zeisan went ahead with things. But it's the first time that there's a challenge, there's a conflict between the Avatar and the Fire Lord for this era. So it's important to realize that Zeisan during this era is not like known to a lot of characters to necessarily be the villainous character that he really goes on to become. But what is interesting is that they are presenting that his sister does know that this is the case, does know that the Fire Nation royal family has been like this for a while, which makes sense if you remember the Kyoshi novels and the fact that, like, Zoryu and what happened in that book, the manipulation that he pulled, what he plans to do, how the Fire Nation kind of went from being sort of like the clans are the main sort of focus. The Fire Lord is still important, but the clans is a huge thing, to suddenly the clans aren't really much of a thing. We're not talking about the clans of the Fire Nation anymore, the different islands. It's the Fire Lord and that's it. And you get the idea that over the generations leading up to Zeisan, we have seen the power really fall completely into the hands of the Fire Lord specifically. And this is going to lead into, of course, this prosperous era for the Fire Nation, but also the start of Sozin wanting to, of course, spread that prosperity, and sort of how does he maintain this control over his people. So the important thing we need to get across here is basically that in the context of Princess Zeisan's story, we are dealing with effectively what's happening with the air nomads and the Fire Nation. And we'll get into this as we go through, of course, as you see. So, the air nomads do their best to keep peace on an international scale by lending aid when requested by the other nations or the Avatar himself. However, they also face their own problems with a renegade order called the Guiding Wind. Remember this is important. The Guiding Wind believes the air nomads have grown complacent in their search for enlightenment and seek too much cooperation with the corrupt and exploitative wealthy citizens of other nations. Many elders denounced the Guiding Wind for their disruptive actions, with the air nomads being pulled in so many directions. It seems to be only a matter of time before the stresses overwhelm them and they're spread too thin to help everyone. And you have to keep in mind that what they're doing with this era is also setting the stage for what happens when the air nomad genocide happens. Why are the air nomads able to be wiped out so thoroughly in such a swift strike? Yes, the comet is powerful and gives the Fire Nation an advantage, but you have to also establish that the air nomads are spread thin. There's not a lot of protection in a way at the temples because they're spread out around the place. Because you have to remember, it's not that just the attacks on the temples wiped everyone out. There was also the hunt afterwards to try and lure out the stragglers basically across the world. That was also part of it in the aftermath of the initial attacks as well. So in a way, there being so much spread is part of why this was even able to happen in the first place. So a lot of interesting setup stuff here. Now, the reason the air nomads are important is because of this. The Guiding Wind is also active in the Fire Nation, where young nobility embrace air nomad philosophy. This movement is in part led by Fire Lord Sozin's sister Zeisan, who intends to swear off her earthly possessions in exchange for a life of austerity. But the air nomad and his sister are just two of the problems the new Fire Lord intends to tackle. After bringing the warring families of the Fire Nation to heel, so dealing with the last little bits of the clans, basically, the Fire Lord has made great strides towards progress in his country, and we're building up to the Sozin that we actually know here. So there's a bunch of key players in all of this. The leader of the Guiding Wind, Princess Zeisan herself, Sozin is important, and so on. The other nations aren't particularly important within Zeisan's story, but I would definitely recommend you guys check out the information that there is out there about it. So just that. There's some themes here. There's no details in that necessarily. This is key. The Fire and Air Center of Learning. So, air nomad philosophy's growing influence in the Fire Nation has led to Fire Nation citizens building a place to teach air nomad culture in the Fire Nation. The center is funded by a select group of Fire Nation nobles who've embraced air nomad teachings and pushed for a partnership between both nations. While the air nomads hesitated at first, all four temples eventually supported the idea as a way to forge peace and cooperation between the nations. But the Guiding Wind, a group of air nomads who believe the corrupt nobles are leading the air nomads away from spiritual enlightenment, have sabotaged the construction of the center on numerous occasions in protest. In response, Sozin has seized control of the building site and put his military in there to protect the people. He won't remove them until the Guiding Wind leaves, and the Guiding Wind has no plans in halting their sabotage until the construction ends completely. So you can see here, it's a very complicated situation here, where the center is kind of this thing where like it's becoming almost like a fad in the Fire Nation, and we need this like official center to promote it. And the air nomads, the actual leaders of the temples, believe that this is a good thing that will lead to peace. The people who are believing in the air nomad philosophies on the Fire Nation side believe it can bring peace. But the Guiding Wind believe that this is just this thing that is almost making a mockery of air nomad teachings and cultures. That these are just nobles like acting like they're pseudo air nomads. And and it's not really what we need to do. And that they believe that rather than what's going to happen, which is the air nomads influencing the people of the Fire Nation, they're worried that the reverse will happen, and that the nobles that they're dealing with will have more of an impact on the leadership of the air nomads and lead them astray than anything. And then in all of this, Sozin doesn't like this because, of course, he's trying to get his house in order ahead of his expansion plans for the Fire Nation. The last thing he needs is the air nomad teachings taking root in the Fire Nation and him never being able to kind of influence a whole section of his people, especially when it's the nobles, like the wealthy people, kind of supporting him effectively, who are the ones beginning to turn to this philosophy. So you can see why he's trying to get in the way of all of this. But it's a weirdly complicated situation, because Sozin wants the guiding wind gone, but the guiding wind also want the center gone. And it's this complicated situation of like, what does Sozin do? Because he kind of has a loyalty. He would kind of almost want to go with the guiding wind to get the center gone and then maybe turn on the guiding wind. But he's straight away committed to being anti-guiding wind. And the reason for that will come up in just a second, of course. We'll get there because of this. So stoking the fire. One major conflict of this era that plays out behind the curtains of Smoke and Fire is the conflict brewing between Firelord Sozin and his sister, Princess Zeisan. Zeisan follows air nomad philosophy, and her goal is to dethrone her family, who she believes is evil to the core. Now, straight away, this presents an interesting idea of like, well, she's part of this, and obviously she grew up with Sozin, and we assume whoever Sozin's father was led them to think a very specific way. She somehow managed to get away from this, likely with, we assume, the same sort of dynamic that happened between Zuko and Azula, and Ozai and Iroh, where one of them commits to the ideal a little bit more, which allows the other one to almost like escape from it a little bit. And so in this case, Zeisan has a better sense for like, oh, what we are doing is not good. So she has focused on her air nomad teachings to help stay away from this kind of philosophy of the evil line of the royal family, basically. Her actions infuriate her brother to no end. However, a deep story brews beneath the surface. When Zeisan first started her training with the air nomad sister Ryo-shan, the two women fell in love. Sadly, Zeisan's goals to unravel her brother's plans required a politically motivated marriage to a monk named Kandro, rather than a romantic one to Ryo-shan. So the two women's love goes unvoiced. They both understand that there are greater things at stake than their own personal happiness. Zeisan and Kandro have a similar understanding. Both have a lot to gain from marrying one another, and they are working together as allies to take down the Fire Nation nobility. Current Fire Nation norms are friendly to queer couples, so the two women could have a public relationship, but Sozin goes on to outlaw same-sex couples before the end of this era. So we're finding out, in a way, I suppose this is sort of early setup for, why does Sozin do that? Why does he get rid of same-sex relationships when it was a normal thing? And then, why does he hate the air nomads so much that he would wipe them out? Not just try and find who the Avatar is and like capture them, but wipe out an entire people. And you're sort of seeing a little bit of setup towards that, where they threatened his reign. Even though there was no real intent to take over, he views the air nomads assisting the nobilities with, adapting to their culture as being a major threat. And so you can see why part of it is, yes, I want to find the new Avatar, so I'll wipe them out. But also it's like, so something like what happened here can never happen again. And then if Zeisan is such a thorn in his side, you can get the impression that he's probably going to use, if he ever discovers about Zeisan's relationship with Ryo-shan, he will use that against her and likely view that as being something that sort of quote-unquote corrupted her. And so his hatred against both of these things leads to him making these crazy decisions that he does later on. So there's some interesting kind of build-up to some of this stuff happening here. Kandro is the leader of the Guiding Wind. I don't think I've said that yet. So that's the important thing to realize here in terms of the whole conflict with this, is that Sozin doesn't want to work with the Guiding Wind because there's a arranged marriage between his sister who opposes him and the leader of the Guiding Wind. And there is your other complication in all of this. Because otherwise, like I said, there are elements of Guiding Wind and Sozin that they both don't want the like more official fad-like cultural center to be a thing anymore. So that's very, very, very interesting. But anyway, so then we get to Zeisan's own kind of entry here. So Princess Zeisan, a chi-blocking princess working to undo her family's corruption. She was born without firebending and spent her childhood pitted against her brother to prove her worthiness. To survive her family, she devoted herself to air nomad training under Sister Ryoshan, who taught her many things including chi-blocking. Zeisan shares her brother's intensity and doubts her own ability to be good, but is focused on dismantling her family's corruption. So that's a really key part. That's probably the main bit of like what her true characterization actually is that she is a Fire Nation royal. She has the ability to do a lot of that stuff, but she's directed in more of a right way. But she still questions if she is doing the right thing. A la kind of Zuko, I suppose, Iroh type thing. The more reasonable side of the sort of like siblings of the Fire Nation type thing. During training, they fell in love, but their pairing was not advantageous to Zeisan's dynasty toppling ambitions. Instead, she has just announced her intention to marry Khandro of the Guiding Wind, and wishes to renounce her titles and wealth in favour of a spiritual life. Her example is popular enough that other young nobles now vow the same, and Zeisan senses in the Guiding Wind the destabilizing element she needs to undermine her brother. The princess can be a powerful ally with political help or to escape trouble with the nobility. So the idea here is that Zeisan is going to gain the popularity of the young nobles, the young people with the kind of power in those positions. And this will help to sort of erode some of the power that Sozin has from maybe like the older nobles, and this is how she's hoping to make a change for the better in the Fire Nation by utilizing some of these air nomad ideals to change things for the better. There's obviously more complexity that would be explored if this was told in an actual story, and we'll get to discussing, you know, what way they might actually go ahead with that, because there's no real conclusion in the information presented here. There's a lot of setup, but we don't actually know what ends up happening beyond, I suppose, the sense that, well, if we're only learning about Zeisan here and Sozin is able to be basically successful with what he wants to do, I guess Zeisan fails. I guess the Guiding Wind fails fundamentally, but how does it all fall down is the real sort of like question. The Sozin entry is sort of interesting as well. He's eager to make a name for himself. His father, a staunch traditionalist, allowed Fire Nation's internal politics to proceed as they had for decades. He took a more aggressive stance in relation to nobility. He quashed the remaining internal infighting between families or clans, basically. And now his one major roadblock has been some of the nobles embracing the air nomad ideals and his sister, of course. But interestingly, to counteract his sister's influence, he's begun nationalistic propaganda campaigns targeting the poorest members of society. He's generous to those less fortunate and wins people over by providing food, shelter, and work, which are all dependent on his success as Fire Lord. So, you know, the real sense here of like, does he actually care, or is he just doing this to gain support? And it very much seems to be that way. So a real kind of contrast here of just like, that will make him look good, helping the poor people in society. Whereas like Zeisan is getting the support from like the young nobles. And on the outside looking in, that can seem a little bit weird. But the reality of it is that Zeisan is the one who's, I think, ultimately got the best for the Fire Nation at heart, rather than Sozin, who, what we know, goes on to do. So then we go into this one. So the Princess and the Fire Lord, this is, again, a little bit more depth here. Now, a lot of this stuff is ultimately rephrasing of stuff we've heard before, but it adds a little bit extra on every single time. So she is earnest in her plan to give up her riches and rank for a life of poverty and service, even though it would frustrate her family. However, she knows Sozin is angry. When he's angry, he gets sloppy. maybe she can trick him into revealing his schemes to her. She's seen his avarice firsthand and knows it's only a matter of time until he makes a big move to show off his power. Political backstabbing isn't in line with air nomad ideals she tries to adhere to, but she's willing to abide this evil if it means she can ultimately do good. So there's that sense of like, she has that sort of like Zuko, what is the right thing to do situation going on, where she realizes that she will have to do some stuff like this to ultimately get what she wants. Sozin was blindsided by his sister's relationship with the Guiding Wind's leader, Khandro, and nearly couldn't control his rage when she proposed marriage to the monk. He sees the Guiding Wind's anti-nobility beliefs as a direct threat to him, and is determined to stop her by any means necessary. He's fought with Zeisan for as long as he can remember, and now that he's Fire Lord, he refuses to back down. So again, even more complexity in there of like, there's one thing he agrees on here, which is like the opposition to the cultural center, but he doesn't agree with how anti-nobility they are, because he needs the nobles to kind of support him to ultimately have control. But Zeisan's relationship here threatens to have the loyalty of the nobles be with the air nomad kind of faction in the Fire Nation and Zeisan. So very interesting political stuff going on here overall. I won't go too much into the air nomad stuff, but the basic idea here is you have Yudron, who is the kind of actual elder, leader of some of the temples, and he represents the want to actually work with the elites of the other nations to, embrace some air nomad teachings and hopefully create a stronger relationship between them. He believes that this can actually happen, and it is noted that he is cautious, but he still wants to go ahead with this. Also interesting that they note that he does begin to hide kind of air nomad kind of teachings and relics around the place, almost expecting something to happen, which is somewhat interesting. Khandro, of course, is the other side of things, the opposition to Yudron, because he is the leader of the guiding. He's the leader of the Guiding Wind. So he argues that the relationship between air nomads and nobility of the world has impeded the spiritual growth of the people across all of the nations. So he believes that he'll reach spiritual enlightenment, and that marrying Zeisan, the sister of the Fire Lord, will help him to destabilize the nobility structures in the Fire Nation. And he has an abiding respect for Zeisan and what she's willing to do to unravel the corruption in her country. So he has to marry the princess against the advice of his acolytes. So this is not agreed to. This is an unusual alliance, and the kind of people on both sides of it aren't for it necessarily happening. So very, very interesting stuff overall. So currently, he's recruiting members of the air nomad temples to his cause. Those who feel they're being spread too thin or worry about the nobility's influence have embraced his teachings. He can be a powerful ally, and if they prove they believe in the Guiding Wind's ideals. Ryoshan. So, a chi-blocking air nun famed for her martial prowess. A skilled airbender and chi-blocker from the Western Air Temple. Sought the world over for her martial skills. She's serious, intelligent, and speaks honestly in most situations, even if it means angering people. She, interestingly, is, she does adhere to the principles, the traditional principles, but she is not Guiding Wind. They never say she is Guiding Wind. So I guess the idea with Ryoshan is that she's somewhere in the middle of Yudron and Khandro, but enough that she supports, I suppose, ultimately the potential good that Zeisan's marriage alliance with Khandro will do. But she's working in the background to obviously, of course, try and protect the person that she loves. And that's kind of what is talked about here. She worries harm may befall the princess and that she might have to step in. And that's sort of what an urgent request adventure is sort of all about. The heroes being hired to protect her. And obviously they tease the idea here of like they have to stay apart for fear that Sozin might discover their love for each other and use it against his sister. So that's the other thing in all of this. And you assume the way this actually plays out, probably something like that might actually happen. So there's that. And then for anyone wondering about the slight complex situation of like nobility and the Guiding Wind, it's explained here. Some may find the idea that the Guiding Wind accepting Fire Nation, Earth Kingdom, or even Water Tribe nobility into their ranks perplexing. What's important to remember is the young nobles who join the Guiding Wind are rebels just like the movement. They're the ultimate fist in the face to the ideal of nobility. Because these youths gave up their wealth and power for enlightenment, whereas the nobles supporting the Fire and Air Center of Learning did not, Kandro gladly welcomes any nobles into his order who adhere to his ideals. So he is fine with nobility joining kind of like the air nomad philosophy if they fully commit to it. What he doesn't like is the people who go to the Fire and Air Center of Learning kind of only half do it, and he feels that this is ultimately kind of corrupting the air nomads more than it's influencing the Fire Nation. And that's kind of his problem in all of this. So it also is kind of covered here, the idea that, you know, the Guiding Wind is not officially recognized. It is kind of a splinter group. The Eastern Temple views them as too disruptive. The Northern Temple views them as being too extreme. The West is too in opposition to tradition. And the South has yet to take an official stance. But he criticizes them all. Interestingly, he worries about his movements because there's a string of violent acts supposedly perpetrated by members of his order in the Fire Nation. They don't agree with violent acts and they don't do them. He can't trace any of the reports to known members. Who's doing it? And obviously I think the implication here is Sozin is probably having his people act like, wear basically the clothing of the Guiding Wind, act like they're part of the Guiding Wind, and commit these crimes to defame the group. I think that's very clear what is actually happening. And I get the feeling that that's probably one of the bigger things that might actually end up happening here, because in the context of what this story is and what kind of has to happen, it seems like the Guiding Wind eventually goes away. Zeisan disappears or something like that. And I think the only way to explain it is that, does he frame sort of like the quote-unquote death of Zeisan on the Guiding Wind, and that kills all the birds with just one stone. But how exactly does this get kind of like orchestrated is the interesting point in all of this. So a lot of moving parts here, and there's the amazing setup and potential for a story with what's going on here, with the very cool idea of the air nomad teachings taking root in the Fire Nation, and the complex situation because of the difference between the actual leader's view on this situation within the air nomads, and then the Guiding Wind's view. And then like Zeisan is kind of more on that side of things, but like Roshan is kind of somewhere in the middle. Sozin is against this in its entirety because he wants to have control over the Fire Nation, and this is going against what he wants. So many great ideas, and we're even like quite heavily expanding on Sozin in all of this as well. Interestingly, Roku isn't really involved in this, and I suppose theoretically can't be involved too much in whatever this story is, unless there's some crazy secret reveals that like we didn't really know about. But I think that's the big thing here, is like, this is all set up for a story. There's no resolution here. We are not told what happens to Zeisan. So we don't have a clue where this goes. Where does the Guiding Wind go in all of this? How are these characters ultimately, taken out or whatever? Because these things don't seem to particularly take root as far as we're aware. At least, as far as we are aware, who knows? Maybe the Guiding Wind does persist up until the Air Nomad genocide, but they're wiped out all the same. Or are they taken out as a group before this because of Sozin's manipulations? Who actually knows? I think very clearly they are suggesting that Sozin will discover this relationship having happened, and this will be part of why he outlaws same-sex relationships. It's just him knowing about this and knowing how big of a nuisance his sister is to him. That's part of that. And very clearly, the whole Air Nomad fiasco in the Fire Nation is going to be part of the reason why he harbors a bigger hatred for the Air Nomads beyond just the next avatar will be an Air Nomad. So a lot of great stuff, and I think there's so much potential with Zeisan as a character. It's not just that there's interesting lore stuff going on here. Zeisan is a character who does seem quite interesting because she is very aware about the royal family's corruption and the fact that her brother has completely gone down this road. So And the fact that she doubts her own ability to do good, I suppose, because she's been raised in this, typical Fire Nation royal family situation of like spent her childhood pitted against her brother, because we know about that's the way that the royal family operates. If you have two children, you stoke that rivalry to basically make both of them loyal to the Fire Nation and ruthless in a way. So she manages to get away from that because of the Air Nomad stuff in Ryoshan. But where does she go from here? That's super interesting to me. It won't be a comic where we get this story told, because the comics just have never focused on the other eras really for the most part. And I don't think there's really a particular way for this to just be a flashback in the middle of an Avatar comic. So it's not going to be that. We've not heard anything about Roku era content for the Avatar Studios animations. So realistically, if we're going to get the Zeisan story, it probably has to be in one of the novels, Chronicles of the Avatar or something like that. Because I think most people expect that the next stuff after Yang Chen will be either Avatar Zito or they'll do Roku. Now, the problem here, like I said earlier, was I don't know how involved Roku can necessarily be in the Zeisan story because of where it is set and when Roku begins to realize that Sozin is a problem. So that's a bit of an interesting one in that he kind of almost has to be doing his own separate thing while this happens behind the scenes. And how can you make that work? Like, does this become the side story, or do you interestingly change up that book and maybe have Roku not be the focus character, and maybe Zeisan is the focus character and it's more Roku who's the side plot? I don't know, because I don't think those books have to be Avatar focused at all times. Like, I suppose once you see a little bit of Roku, you'll be happy, because I think this is the interesting story where like you focus on what's going on here with the Air Nomad Fire Nation kind of dynamic and expand on that, because it seems like there's a lot going on. And maybe if there is like Roku, the reason Roku kind of misses what's all happening here is because of some of the other stuff that's being dealt with in the era. That could actually be make for some interesting stuff, in that there are little conflicts happening, disputes over kind of land and waters and territory that Roku might be involved with that could be interesting to deal with as well. And you just have two very separate plots, and maybe have some sort of a thing where Roku comes like this close to uncovering the truth about Sozin well before he actually kind of does. That could be quite interesting, but it does prompt the idea of like, does Zeisan have like no relationship with Roku? Like, it seems like she should want to kind of bring Roku in on this, especially if, Roku and the Air Nomads are working together with this stuff. But I suppose there's a lot of kind of underhanded stuff going on, positioning that maybe this information just isn't getting through to Roku. So yeah, I'm pretty much going to wrap it up there. So let me know in the comments what your thoughts are on Princess Zeisan. Of course, the brand new image that we have of her, what her design is like now that we see it, but also what your thoughts are on her character, the different elements of the Roku era that she's involved in. Where do you think these things are going? Do you think it will be a novel where we get her story told? Because the Legends RPG stuff doesn't seem to ever resolve plots that it sets up. So we're going to get this somewhere, it feels like. There's no way we can just leave this untold. But right now it is a bit of a mystery how exactly Zeisan's story plays out. But it is fascinating. So in the comments, let me know what your thoughts are on Princess Zeisan. But that has been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.